Now, for this week in Rhetoric, we're going to be discussing, once again, something that comes up a lot more often than it should, and that is the fallacy of equivocation. When it comes to communicating with people, we always, of course, inform you that you need to listen to what's being said, but listening doesn't always mean understanding, because people who either unintentionally or intentionally, through manipulation or just a common mistake, maybe they've heard this from someone else and are confusing the terms because their idea is more at the forefront of their mind, they will mix words' meanings with each other, but use the same word. In English, this is especially hazardous because our language is chock full of these things, where unintentionally we can say one word and it has a plethora of meanings, and without clarifying our terms, then we end up, saying either the opposite of what we intended or catching someone in a mistake that's unfair to them because they were understanding us to mean the same thing for using the same word. Now, when it comes to equivocation, obviously there are things we need to be aware of when it's used against us, but also things we need to be aware of, more importantly, when using them. And of course, it should all start with a dictionary, should it not?
Yeah, absolutely. And like some of our more recent rhetoric lessons, if you notice, we started with the ones that were more could have been done by accident. We're moving more and more into the ones that have to have some amount of intent in order to perform. Now, it is possible to perform this fallacy accidentally, but it's much more rare. It's much more common to do this one intentionally. So what it means is taking a word in one context and interpreting it in a completely different context. So there are many examples that I could give, but let me give a really common one that's happening right now in the political worldview. So there is this word, it's called disinformation. You may have heard of it before. Now, disinformation means something very specific. It means that a foreign nationality or a foreign entity that is hostile to us is intentionally sowing false information into our news sources, our news outlets, in order to rig elections or to disrupt our political system or to disrupt the country as a whole. That's disinformation. And disinformation is a very powerful propaganda tool. It has been utilized throughout human history, actually. It's nothing new. And it is illegal, right? If there was a foreign entity like, say, Russia or China or North Korea that was filtering false information into Twitter or YouTube or Facebook and intentionally trying to disrupt our country, that would be bad and it ought to be shut down. So disinformation is bad. It has nothing to do with free speech. However, a new word has popped up that is intentionally similar to disinformation: misinformation. Now, misinformation basically just means anything that could be false. Now, the problem with that is that if you're going to have free speech alive and well inside of a culture, people have to be willing and able to say things that may or may not be true. And it's not right or correct for some sort of an authoritative figure to assume intent, to assume you're intentionally disinforming people. You're intentionally spreading information that's falsifiable in order to correct people, in order to corrupt people or to disrupt the society as a whole. You don't know that. And beyond that, these people aren't from foreign governments or entities, so they can't be qualified in that way. But many politicians are using this word misinformation and disinformation interchangeably. That's an equivocation error. And it's actually, not only is it the equivocation fallacy, but it's taking it one step further, where they're intentionally misidentifying words. They're intentionally utilizing words that sound like one another in order to misinform, ironically.
So one consonant, and we've already made a jump between a criminal and usually wartime effort and offense into something that's used for censorship, for political gain.
Exactly. Let me give you another couple common ones that are alive and well right now, and then me and Sean will talk about a biblical example, and we'll give you possible ways to maybe skirt around the equivocation fallacy to be able to figure it out. Another reason, by the way, before I get into these others, another reason why this is so dangerous is because the main purpose of communication is to understand one another. That's why God gave us language. And if you remember, the first empire that rose and fell in the Bible is Babylon. Why did Babylon fall? It's because God confused their language. When language is utilized as a weapon, it causes societies to crumble, right? However big those societies are, whether it's a culture and society of a family unit or it's a culture and society of a country, when language is confused, that culture can't stand for very long. We have to have common language in order to be able to communicate. So another common one that's used, I'll use ones from both the right side of the political aisle as well as the left side of the political aisle. So this is one from the left side of the political aisle. This is what we call cancel culture. So it's pulling out any literature that we find offensive nowadays. So one of the books that's on the chopping block, it's been on the chopping block since I was in high school, is Huckleberry Finn. Now, Huckleberry Finn is a very pro-abolitionist book, actually, where you have a white Southern boy freeing a black slave, and it's actually really good. It's actually a very good book written by Mark Twain. But because the N-word is utilized in it, it's considered to be banned. Now, the problem is that what the N-word meant when Mark Twain was writing it means something very different than the way that we use it today. So the way that people use it today, especially people who aren't black, they use it as an insult. They use it as a degradation term. I'm degrading you. I am stealing your humanity. And at the time that Mark Twain wrote this word, it was common parlance. Everybody used the word. And in fact, the way he uses it, it's actually not intended to be offensive. You can tell that the way it's being utilized is not intended to be offensive. To modern ears, very offensive, because our understanding of that word has shifted over time. Right?
And the utilization of it is very inconsistent, ironically.
Yeah, that is true too. Another one from the left side of the aisle. This would be any type of denial, COVID denial, climate denial, Holocaust denial, things like that. Now, the reason why they're using these words, COVID denial and climate denial, is because they are equivocating it with Holocaust denial. They are intentionally making people think of Holocaust denial. And that is something that is so obviously true that only a conspiratorial nut would deny it. And that's why they utilize that language. Another one that's interesting is the big lie. You may have heard that before. Now, the big lie is a direct reference to Hitler, right? There's a reason why they're utilizing that. Most people who utilize it don't realize that by saying the big lie, you're putting yourself in Hitler's shoes, because Hitler is the one that said it. Hitler wasn't the one accused of making the big lie. He was the one making the accusation of the big lie.
Thought that his National Aryan Socialist Party was the answer to those lies.
That's right. In the right side of the aisle. Now, the right side of the aisle, we tend to use, people on the right side of the aisle can utilize things that are true, but they misappropriate them. So, for instance, gender ideology. Some people are so obsessed with gender ideology that they misappropriate things into gender ideology categories that actually aren't. It doesn't make them good. It just means that they don't belong in that category, because they know that it's just a classification that most people on the right will immediately have a visceral reaction to. That's bad. Critical race theory is another one. So again, it's not that critical race theory isn't real. It is real. Maybe one of these Tuesdays, me and Sean will go over exactly what it is and where it comes from. But oftentimes it's just, I don't like this, so I'm going to call it critical race theory. I had a Christian teacher at our church, very wonderful woman, and someone was accusing her of teaching critical race theory because she was teaching the truth about slavery. Now, and when I say slavery, I mean the black African slave trade that existed in the continental United States. Now, she wasn't
institutionalized by Islam, by the way.
Yeah, yeah. There's many things we could say about that. But at any rate, this was someone who was just like, essentially, I just don't like what you're teaching. I don't know how to accuse you of doing something wrong, so I'm just going to use this word against you in order to...
That's not what the word means.
When that's not what the word means, right? Just like the Princess Bride. You keep using that word.
I don't think it means what you think it means.
So that is the equivocation fallacy in a nutshell. In interpersonal relationships, this is the biggest one that I see as a Christian counselor: abuse. So when you're doing marriage counseling, most marriage counselors within the church would agree that abuse, if not a qualification for divorce, would at least recommend separation and severe consequences for abusive behaviors within a marriage. I'm actually of the predisposition to believe that genuine abuse could qualify for a biblical divorce. But without getting into that, if you have questions about why I think that way, you go ahead and ask.
Read Malachi and know that.
But at any rate, because of that, people have now broadened the term abuse to incorporate all sorts of things. So they say, well, he was emotionally abusive to me. Now, it's a real thing, But okay, give me a definition. How is he emotionally or she emotionally abusive to you? Well, there was this one time we were arguing and he yelled at me. Or there was this other time where she called me an idiot. They're like, okay, that's not nice, but it's not emotional abuse, right? Someone in the heat of the moment throwing out a name is not emotional abuse, especially if they apologize for it later, right? This is just in the heat of the moment saying something stupid. Now, you could say it's an abusive behavior, but it has to incorporate a longer-term propensity or a larger scale in order to be qualified as emotional abuse. Same with like physical abuse. Well, he's never hit me per se, but there was this one time where we were in an argument and I was holding on to something and he was holding on to it and he tugged on it, and that's physical abuse. Well, that's a hard sale. That's not exactly physical abuse. So that's another one that we see all the time. Or an affair. People will say like, well, Jesus says that to lust after a woman in your heart is affair or adultery of the heart. Therefore, he lusted and therefore he committed adultery. Well, it's like, that's not really what the Bible's talking about when it's talking about sexual immorality being a pre-existing condition that could result within a divorce. The Bible is talking about physical adultery, or it's talking about lustful behavior that's abusive to the point that it would consummate that. So, for instance, if someone is watching pornography for like 9 hours a day or something like that, or they're constantly degrading their wife's looks and comparing them to other women, there are behaviors that would constitute that without physically committing adultery. But again, there's a magnitude in mind there when you use language like that. When you say he committed adultery, she cheated on me, he was abusive, she was abusive, right? When you use language like that, there's an intent behind the language and you're equivocating. You're utilizing a word in a sense that is not intended in order to get your way, right? In order to win an argument.
But that's the whole point, is the intention is to utilize not what's happening, but the emotions associated with a word in order to make your case. So if you're talking to someone who's using terms, either A, unnecessarily, or B, overemphasizing the severity of the detail beyond what's reality, you need to be able to spot that and properly deal with it. Now, if someone is using equivocation, unintentionally or otherwise, they have the same solution, do they not?
Yeah, they do. So let me give you Jesus's encounter with this fallacy and how he addresses it. So this is Matthew chapter 15 and verse 3. He answered and said to them, "Why do you also transgress the commandment of God because of your tradition? For God commanded, saying, 'Honor your father and your mother,' and he who curses father or mother, let him be put to death. But you say, whoever says to his father or mother, 'Whatever profit you might have received from me is a gift to God,' then he need not honor his father or mother. Thus, you have made the commandment of God no effect by your tradition." Okay, so this is what was happening. The Pharisaical kind of branch or sect of Judaism at the time had come up with a workaround. So the word honor, when you see that in the Bible, it does mean to give obeisance or respect or things like that, but it actually has a very literal definition, and that is to give monetary honor. That's how you see it utilized this way frequently throughout the Bible. It talks about honoring that the elders that rule over you are worthy of double honor. And again, he's talking about the compensation that elders are worthy of. Paul talks about giving honor to the government placed above them in Romans chapter 13. Once again, he's talking about paying taxes, right? So there's a very literal definition to this word, but it does encompass more than just paying money to somebody. Now, when Jesus is looking at this, they're saying, well, we follow the commandments. We're doing all these things. And Jesus says, well, there's a really clear commandment in the Bible. It says, honor your father and mother. Now, the way that they worked around it is they said, well, what's more honoring to your father and mother than to dedicate your all to God? And so, yes, you're not really giving the money directly to your parents, but by taking the money that you were going to use to provide for them in their golden years and giving it to the temple, aren't you doing a greater service to them? Aren't you honoring them even more? And Jesus says, no, the word honor means to pay them, and it says to honor your father and mother. He says you are taking a word and you're molding it to your view, as opposed to molding it to what was intended. So notice what Jesus does. He calls out the equivocation that's being made. He says, this is the word you're using, and then he goes back and he says, this is what the word means. Now, in an argument, it's okay, and I've told people this before when I'm in conversations with them, I don't mind if you use this word in this particular way, but define your terms. if you're going to use this word in this way, be consistent about it. Just keep using it this way, and we'll just know that this is what you mean. Don't use it one way in one context and then shift the meaning in the very next context.
Unless you specify beforehand, and that's what's most important. Clear communication is the goal, not manipulative or at least unintentional misinforming. Remember that word?
That's right. So this is, again, a very simple one. You just have to directly call it out. Hey, you know what? I'm a little confused. You can even give people the benefit of the doubt, be a little nice about it. Say, hey, you're using this word. I'm not really sure what you mean because you're using it in different ways, in different contexts. Like, what do you mean by this word? When you say this, what do you mean by that? And by the way, you'll know very quickly if you're dealing with someone who is arguing with you on good faith terms as opposed to not so good faith terms. Because if they're arguing with you on good faith terms, they'll try to clarify what the confusion is. If they're not, then they will be like, well, what are you talking about? Right? They might gaslight you, be like, I never used that word, or like, you used that word, or they might accuse you of something. They might project, they might diffuse, they might give you a definition and then immediately go back to using the fallacy, right? So this is actually a good test to see if you're arguing on good faith terms with somebody.
And you don't want to talk to someone who either A, isn't listening, or B, isn't actually talking. They're just speaking. So make sure in any communication that's taking place, you pay careful attention to how you're using words and avoid the mistake that Paul the Apostle warned his disciple Timothy of at literally the end of his first epistle. This is 1 Timothy 6 and verse 20. O Timothy, guard what was committed to your trust, avoiding the profane and idle babblings and contradictions of what is falsely called knowledge. People can use terms like the science says. People can use terms like, well, it's been proven. What's your evidence? Well, that's just faith, and not mean what you mean. The first and most important goal in using unique terms should be to make sure it clarifies your meaning, not muddies the water. So to avoid equivocation, either use simpler terms or make sure that if you're going to use a term with different meanings, especially in English, you clarify, this is what I mean, and you spell that out for them. If, on the other hand, they're not willing to return that, then make sure you aren't either A, wasting their time or yours with conversations that aren't actually happening, or even more importantly, you take advantage of the opportunity to learn how to spot those things as the mistakes are either being made or being covered up, because we don't want to, again, make the same mistake twice. And that is, of course, miscommunication. Make sure that in the equivocation error, it's all centered and found on defining your terms, and that is something we should be very eager to do in a world where so many emotions are assumed into words, when in reality we're just saying things. So let us know if that's all clear. Anything more to say before we move on to our questions?
One last thing. I forgot to mention this in my examples, but it's very important for apologetics, especially when you're talking to people who are secular, atheists, things like that. Words like slavery that occur in the Bible are big ones, right? Do you see that a lot at the swap meet? People saying like slavery or concubinage and things like that?
Not as recently as it would seem, but when talking to people, of course, again, emotive terms. Racism, the Bible invented racism. The Bible invented slavery. The Bible tells you to beat your slave, or parents, you're supposed to beat your children. That, again, it means something very different, but it's used in multiple ways to mean the same thing because it appeals to a much more reactive response. And that's the whole point. We don't want to communicate something to someone or be told something that isn't true just because they use the word, and that's something to be aware of as well. So thank you all for this lesson in rhetoric and the time you've invested in it. I hope you get a chance to practice it, hopefully not too many, but we'll be here again next week to discuss more on this very topic.